I was saying thank you and thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you. And I'm gonna speak very, very fast because we have very little time. But maybe another time we can speak for longer. Whatever. So I'm not gonna speak a lot about the book. I'm gonna speak about the ideas in the book. So basically, the idea this book is all about is animals, non-human animals, what we should do about them. And there is this view that many people have that, there is a significant divide between humans and other animals. But then there are ways to challenge this view. So, for instance, there are many films and books and everything where this idea is challenged, the idea that species is relevant in any way. I mean, here you have a picture of a film that clearly challenges this view because Edie, he's not a member of the human species, and nevertheless, we all think that we should take them morally into account. Then there is this other idea that, well, it's not because non-human animals don't belong to the human species that they shouldn't be accorded the moral consideration that we should give to humans. Rather, it's the fact that they don't have certain cognitive abilities or other capacities, or maybe they don't have certain special relationships with us. So we draw, this circle, and we say, okay, we are just going to give full respect to those who are within the circle. What happens then is that not only there are some non-human animals that also fall within that circle, what happens also is that this doesn't quite work because, there are humans who also will fall outside the circle because there are humans who don't have cognitive capacities like those who maybe we here have, and may have cognitive capacities, lower than those of many non-human beings. And also the same happens with relationships. There are human beings who are in a situation of weakness, who don't receive solidarity by other human beings. So this not only applies in the case of some exceptions out there, it applies to everyone here. And all human beings, because we all have been babies, and when we were babies, we didn't have these capacities, and we weren't in a position of power like that of adult human beings. So the issue here is that, if we want to give full respect to all those human beings, that circle is not going to work. We're going to need to draw a different circle there, and we're going to have to reject the first circle. So cognitive capacities and all that, those special relations, they're not going to be what matters in order to give someone respect. But then what happens is, all of a sudden, we've drawn a different circle, and it just so happens that this circle will include other sentient beings, because what matters then to be considered, if we want to include all human beings there, it's going to be something that will include other sentient beings as well, which is basically sentience, the capacity to have negative and positive experiences, which is what matters to be harmed or benefited. And this is something that we can also see if we consider other thought experiments. So, for instance, suppose that, consider two different worlds, and they're exactly the same. The only difference there is that in one of them, human beings give full respect to all non-human animals, just as they give that respect to other human beings, and in the other, they don't. They are species. So what is the world we would prefer? So most people would prefer the world where humans and non-humans aren't considered alike. But that's because they know they are humans. How would we think about this if we didn't know whether we were going to exist as humans or as non-human animals? Well, in that situation, if we are honest, for sure, we would all choose the world where no species distinction is taken into account, right? Especially if we consider that human beings are a tiny minority among other sentient beings. And there are then reasons to think that we are not really considered this issue in a fair way. We are not being impartial. And there are also other ways to consider this. Suppose, for instance, that they tell us that in the future, because of some condition we have or whatever, we're going to lose the cognitive capacities we now have, or we are going to have a different set of relations of that we currently have. would we then say, okay, well, when that happens, it will be totally okay for us to be treated as non-human animals are currently? Well, of course not. I mean, of course, most of us would, maybe there's someone who is partisan enough to accept this implication, but most people, including those who accept treating non-human animals as they are treated today, would not want this to happen to them. So this indicates that our current attitudes towards non-human animals aren't really quite consistent, and that's why we can think of them as instances of speciesism, discrimination, or the discrimination of those who don't belong to a certain species. Now, on the basis of this, we can think that the way in which we currently treat non-human animals, which affect especially aquatic animals, like, for instance, crustaceans, they are killed in the trillions every year, can't be morally acceptable. And this is just becoming worse because new ways of exploiting animals in ever worse ways are devised. And now, with the case of invertebrates, animal exploitation is just growing and growing and growing. So it seems that the reasons we've seen should lead us to challenge this and to think that this can't be quite right. And there are also some other considerations that apply, not when we think abstractly of the question of speciesism, but also when we just compare what happens when we can benefit from inflicting some harm to others, and when we can just refrain from doing so. So there's this example that appears in the book that I think illustrates this in a, well, I hope, in a more or less clear way. And it's this, so suppose there is this red button, and it's not just one red button. There are red buttons like this all around where we live, so many of them. And when you press one of these buttons, there are two things that happen. So the first thing that happens is that you feel some pleasurable experience. You touch it and it's like, oh, this is so nice, you know. And at the same time, what happens is that an animal, or maybe several animals, are going to suffer terribly for a very long time, maybe, and they're going to die. And imagine that in addition to these buttons, there are other blue buttons that you can press, and you also feel like the pleasurable experience, but no animal is harmed. And there is kind of a difference between the sensation you get, but it's not really like a huge difference. Well, when confronted with this, most people would think, well, maybe we should not press the red button. Maybe we should press the blue button instead. But the question here is that if this is so, then how can we justify our continuously pressing this red button in reality? Because of course we are pressing the red button, you know, every single day of our lives. I mean, maybe some people here don't, but most people do. When they use animals as resources in ways that are harmful for them. So the idea here is that while we have the intuition that using animals in this very, very harmful way is acceptable, we also have other intuitions that really challenge that view. So it says that if we make the connection there, it may well be that our current, not just attitudes, but behavior towards animals may be fundamentally wrong. And this is so with regards to harming animals, but this would also apply, or questioning speciesism, to other cases where what is at stake is not whether we should harm animals, but whether we should also benefit animals. So an example, a clear example of that is that of animals helping in the wild. So helping animals well, in the wild, I don't mean just in the wilderness, but wild animals, animals that don't live in captivity, that may be around, maybe in our cities, in agricultural, industrial areas. Now, all around the world, there are many different initiatives directed to helping these animals. There are animal rescue centers, wild animal hospitals where sick, injured, orphaned animals are treated and given help. There are also other initiatives like building burrows and shelters to animals in the wild. There are also vaccination projects against diseases like, for instance, rabies and TB and others. Yeah, it's not that they go with the injection and looking for the animal and then administer to them. They typically do this with oral base that they drop from the air. And all these initiatives, nevertheless, are not that common when you consider the total number of wild animals that there are. And we may think that support for this may be limited, but well, at the organization I work with, Animal Ethics, we did this study a few years ago where we interviewed, actually we surveyed hundreds of students and scholars, and we found out that support for different projects helping wild animals was very significant. You can see there the results for vaccination projects, helping animals in urban environments, helping animals harmed by extreme weather events. So it seems that this should give us also reason, as I said, not just to refrain from harming animals, but also to engage in helping them actively. And this is important because animals living in the wild, against what many people think, they don't live idyllic views. They are harmed due to many different factors, including, for instance, harmful weather conditions, famine, malnutrition, thirst, disease, parasitism, accident, conflicts, and many others. And in fact, I'm not going to show you many pictures of this because I don't want to spoil your day. But something that is very revealing in that respect is that the vast majority of animals out there reproduce by having huge numbers of offspring. The reason being that many of them, unfortunately, can't make it to maturity. Now, there are many cases where, at least currently, we can't do anything about that. But there are others where we can, as we've seen in the examples before. So why not doing this? This will show how we can, in changing this species paradigm, we can not just, as I said before, let me insist on that, refrain from making the situation worse, but helping to making it better for them. So that would be it. I mean, I typically give this talk in a more paused way and calm way. I mean, I take maybe like twice as much time as I did, but you were asking lots of questions an hour ago, so there's no more time. I'm sorry about that. So I'll just say a couple of more things. So one of them is that, on the basis of this, I would encourage also those people who are concerned with this not to think they are alone, because this is something that I found very often in talks about this, at least in the Spanish-speaking world. So many people think, I do care deeply about this, but I'm concerned that I'm part of the minority. Well, you're not part of the minority. There are thousands, maybe millions of people around who just think like this. It's just that you don't know them. And there is a lot of progress that can be done. So I would just give a couple of recommendations here. This is that we should engage in more research in order to know how to best make progress in an effective way. And also, we should avoid the temptation of being short-termist. And I'm very sorry that I don't have the time to explain this because this really is important. But well, we have a session afterwards, 3, I think, where we are going to be speaking about this. But basically, the idea here is that, the idea is based in this concept that is so clear that it's amazing that we don't think more often about that, which is that the future is going to last for a lot. It's going to be very long. And the present is going to be very short. Or put it another way, the near future is very short. The far future is going to be very, it's going to reach very far. So this would be a reason to consider when we think about the world we want to be there, to try to engage in this long-termist thinking and in this long-termist strategic design when it comes to planning our efforts in order to help animals. Because it may well be that the vast majority of sentient beings that will ever exist have not yet existed, that the beings that have existed are only this tiny minority, and what we do now can influence what will happen not just now, but in the future. And there's no reason to discriminate against someone, to consider someone less, because of the time at which that individual exists. So if you want to learn more about this, see you at 3. Otherwise, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
So, Peter, you want to introduce us to your book? Yeah.
So you don't want to have questions for us?
We can take them all later. Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks very much. I want to take just a little time to talk about The Golden Ass, the book that you can see in its Spanish translation on the screen. And some of you may be wondering why I got involved in this. Don't I have better things to do? Perhaps, but I have to say it was a fun project, and I'm hoping that it has some benefits for animals as well. So I don't know how familiar you are with this book. I have to say I was quite unfamiliar with it as recently as 10 years ago, despite having had by then, several decades of writing about and thinking about the status of animals, and also even looking at some fictional works about the status of animals that I'd been got interested in. For example, Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, a famous 19th century novel about the abuse of horses, was one of the earlier ones. But there was Richard Adams' book, The Plague Dogs, which is about experimentation on animals. Coetzee wrote The Lives of Animals, a novel in the form of a lecturer who comes to a university and challenges people to think about the way they're thinking about animals. There's an Australian novelist I like called Sir Edwin Dovey, who wrote a book called Only the Animals, about animals in war. So I'd read a bit of fiction. And I'd heard of The Golden Ass, but didn't know much about it. And if you'd asked me, so when was it written? Who was the author? What's it all about? Maybe I would have said it's probably about a donkey, given the title. But I don't know that I would have known much more about it. And it came onto my radar really because of a recommendation from a contemporary novelist I know who's originally American but lives in Portugal, called Richard Zimler. And he asked me if I knew The Golden Ass, and he said not only is it an interesting work of fiction, but it places the idea of animal rights in the reader's head and heart in an appealing way. And that's what got me interested in it and starting to read it. So for those not familiar with it, it's a novel written by Apuleius in the 2nd century of the Common Era. So Apuleius was born in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, to give you some sense of what we're talking about, and lived in what's now Algeria, but was then part of the Roman Empire. So he was actually an African author, though he wrote in Latin. Now, sort of one surprise was that there were even novels this old. When I was in high school in Australia, I was told that the first novel was Gulliver's Travels, written in 1726. Now, in Spain, you probably think that's a pretty amusing piece of Anglo bias, because obviously Don Quixote was written a good deal earlier, and that's undoubtedly a novel, and that's certainly true. But even to think that that's the first novel is a Eurocentric bias. And if you Google what's the first novel, you're likely to get The Tale of Genji, which was written by Murasaka Shikibu in about the 10th century, a courtier in the court of Japan. But I don't know why Google thinks that, really, when The Golden Ass was written 800 years earlier, and I think is clearly a novel. So that was my first surprise. The second surprise was the suggestion that in some way the idea of animal rights should be in this novel. Because when you think of the Roman era, and what you think of is the circuses that the emperors provided for their to keep the masses happy, which very often were just scenes of animal torture, just All sorts of exotic animals were imported from the far reaches of the Roman Empire to do battle with, either professional gladiators or prisoners or Christians, of course, in some of the stories. And it was completely horrible. And you think, well, did anyone really care about animals if that was what kept the masses happy? But there were kind of voices in the Roman Empire. I was familiar with Plutarch, for example, who wrote an essay on the abstinence from flesh, which unfortunately we only have a fragment of it. But the fragment we have sort of basically is a list of some of the horrors of the Roman Empire and the way they ate, and the idea that trampling a pregnant sow to death gave you, and then cutting her open and eating the embryonic piglets was a special delicacy. So, Plutarch was at least opposed to that. And one interesting thing that struck me when I did finally start to read The Golden Ass is that the protagonist, Lucius, mentions in his sort of introducing himself that he's descended from Plutarch. So there's an interesting connection clearly with the author with some of those ideas. But the second, the next surprise that I got in reading it is that it's actually a fun read. It's a rollicking and quite often rather bawdy tale of a man who gets turned into a donkey because of his excessive curiosity about magic, which goes wrong. But then most of the novel is about the adventures of this donkey, presented in a very sympathetic way. It's maybe it's a bit of an anachronism to say it's a novel about animal rights, but it certainly shows sympathy for the donkey and presents many ways in which the donkey is made to suffer, sometimes by sheer human sadism towards animals, but also sometimes by just the idea that it's okay to exploit animals in order to get the most value out of them, which of course is responsible for an immense amount of animal suffering today in factory farms and elsewhere. The example in The Golden Ass is of the donkey being made to work in a flour mill, walking endlessly around in circles to get the millstone to turn. And interestingly, there are human slaves as well as animal slaves in this flour mill, and their situations are pretty close in some respects. And so you do get the idea that Apuleius is talking about slavery as something for both humans and animals. But in reading it, I thought I realised why it wasn't more popular than it is, and why perhaps I had not come across it. And that is that although there is this rollicking and sometimes quite suspenseful tale of what happens to the donkey, donkeys have big ears and they can hear a lot. And the donkey hears a lot of stories that are being told by other people as the donkey goes through various episodes of life, and the donkey retells those stories. So the narrative of what happens to the donkey with its particular animal focus is constantly interrupted by these tales that get embedded into the story. And while some of those tales are quite interesting in their own right, the tale of Cupid and Psyche is there, and apparently this is the first written version of the tale. They interrupt the narrative, and I found them distracting, and I therefore had the idea of producing an edition in which the embedded tales were cut out. And if you do that, it reduces the length almost by half. So I think what we've now got is something like 37,000 words, a relatively short novel, as compared with something twice that long. I managed to find a publisher for this idea, and I managed to find a translator who would translate it from the Latin, and I was fortunate to find a real scholar of animals in antiquity, as presented in the literature of antiquity, a woman called Ellen Finkelpearl, who's a professor in California. And as it happened, I had no idea when I approached her to do this. She's been a vegetarian for most of her life, and her interest in animals does go along not just with scholarship, but with a real concern for animals. So although she had more attachment as a scholar to the tails, embedded tails, than I did, she did agree to take them out. She asked me to put back a couple that she thought had some relevance to the animal theme, which they did. But basically, we then produced that. I found a couple of illustrators, a couple of Russian sisters who I liked their illustrations, and they agreed to do it. It's not very relevant to the book, but incidentally, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they immediately put out a statement of opposition to this horror, bravely. I'm not totally sure what's happened as a result, but their concern for animals too, as shown by the illustrations, extends to humans as well. So, so the book is out there. It's now been translated into Spanish, and I'm delighted that it is now available for readers of Spanish. I hope it will get into other languages and other translations as well. And I hope that you'll read it, because I hope that you'll enjoy reading it and maybe spread the word about it and get more people to know about it. And I think it should be better known, and also get more people to see that the idea of sympathy and concern, sympathy for animals and concern, or perhaps I should say empathy, really feeling what it's like to be an animal, and concern for animals, was there in the second century, and it's something that we can still relate to and connect with, and I think that's encouraging for thinking that there's an important strand of human thought and compassion and ethics that surfaces even in fairly inhospitable circumstances. And I find that an encouraging thought for spreading these ideas in other parts of the world where at the moment there isn't a great deal of concern for animals. Thanks very much.
Okay, I'll take some questions for Oscar first, and then we can go into the long session of Ask Peter Singer anything. Could be about this or the other topics we discussed. So, who has questions for Oscar? Yes?
¿Te lo puedo decir en español? Well, I'm sorry, I forgot about. How about the long term that you explained before, that we should think in a long term? What do you mean exactly? Focus it, for example, in activism, because I try to act and to think, thinking about the consequences of my actions as a vegan, as an activist. But yeah, I have this problem sometimes, because we can be very emotional while doing activism. So in a short term, it can be easier to take action than not in a long term. But I'm curious about, what did you mean exactly when you said long-term actions and, yeah, to think in a future?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And yeah, as I said, we'll elaborate further in the other session. But basically, you may distinguish targeted approaches and broad approaches. So targeted approaches would be ways to influence the future that, if successful, can be very influential in certain particular, very specific areas, and then broad approaches will work generally in most scenarios that we can reasonably expect to happen, and while they will be like more vague. So for instance, examples of the first would be things like trying to substitute as the main source of proteins for human consumption, animal proteins. instead. Well, whatever, use something else instead. Because this may be, relevant not just for the next few decades, but also, it may condition how the different trajectories for the future that may happen from there on may go. And as for broad interventions, you may think, for instance, of achieving a change in attitudes. Not on behaviors, but in attitudes. There is this important distinction. So you want to change how people think, not just how people behave. The way people behave, that's relevant in the short term. In the long term, it may be, for instance, much more significant to have more people be aware that animals matter and that we shouldn't act in bad ways towards them, than, for instance, the fact that we eat vegan or not. So, for instance, suppose that you can make the following decision. You either turn a group of people into plant eaters, so they will not eat animal products, but out of reasons that don't have to do with the interests of animals, like their health or whatnot, or you lead those people to think that animals should be taken into account, even if that doesn't necessarily drive them to right now stop eating animals. So from a long-term viewpoint, the latter would be more important. So yeah, basically, it would be a bit more complex than this. We also want changes in society to be eventually consolidated by institutional change. But yeah, that would be like a hint of what kind of approach you may have.
Oh, okay, over there.
Hi, thank you for both of your presentations. I have a question, but it's more of a technical one for you, Oscar. When you were talking about intervention in nature and the attitude from people about it, you mentioned that Animal Ethics did a survey. I was wondering about which kind of unis or institutions were involved and which kind of questions you asked, because usually talking about helping wild animals is difficult when talking like with people who is in this kind of environment. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't have the time to explain it in more detail, and I didn't actually bring with me the slides to show you that. But basically, it was an open survey. It was more than 300 people. So what we did is we reached a few thousand scholars in biology, veterinary science, and other related fields like environmental studies, and then students in those fields. I don't remember exactly how many countries they were from, but many all around the world. And we weren't asking them about their attitudes towards helping animals. We were asking them about different research projects whose focus was to develop better ways of helping animals. And we asked them several things, not just whether they thought they were interesting, but also whether they thought that they would get support from their institutions, whether they thought their colleagues would support them, and all this. Something we found that was very interesting is that most scholars, and also this happened among students as well, but mostly among scholars, gave a more positive answer when they were reporting their own attitudes than what they thought that other scholars would think. And this is also very relevant because, it shows that we are in this situation like the one Constantine has talked about, which is previous to social change. So what happens is that when many people have a certain idea, but they think that other people don't share it. So at the point at which they realize that other people do share it as well, then some cascade effect can take place. And yeah, I'm sorry I can't, if I had the slides, I could show you, but yeah, maybe later if you want, I can show them.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It relates to the previous discussion about population. You were just saying that it can be really important to change people's attitudes in the future, maybe more important than what you eat now. One way to ensure, well, not ensure, but make it more probable that some people in the future will have positive attitudes to animals and will be vegan or vegetarian, is if you are yourself a vegan or vegetarian with positive attitudes to animals and you have children. Is this a reason for having children that maybe counts against some of the reasons against having children that may relate to the damage that we were talking about, that it can do to the world and climate and animals as well?
Well, I think that if you consider what you can do, if you don't have children, you're going to save a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time, that if you use them in having an impact, well, the impact that you're going to have is much more significant. So you are going to be able to turn much more, many more people into vegans, or change their minds, that if you just change maybe a couple of people that you're going to raise as your children. Now, having said this, of course, if they're like the majority of vegans, for instance, are not animal activists, they do nothing but just live their lives without harming animals. So if they have children, it's true that what you're saying is the case. But yeah, I would be reluctant from here to advocate, have vegan children, because I think that is more useful to that, because then, well, the fact is that, I have never met anyone who has, out of an intellectual argument against natalism, changed their views about that. So it's like, I really want to have a child, but I'm not going to have it. I'm not going to have her out of moral reasons. I've never seen that. But in case that may happen, and then those people may use their resources, I don't know, they may donate it or something, the money they get, then I think it's better not to spread that view.
Okay, I think I have met such people, although maybe they were not very strongly inclined to have children. But I think I have met people who at least have said that that was a factor in their decision not to have children.
When is the next?
Yeah. So how do you think about trade-offs in order to maximize welfare in wild animal suffering situations? So you have situations where you can help mammals, but you can also help fish or shrimp or animals that are there in very large quantities. So the amount of suffering of those animals, the population of those animals is way bigger. So how do you, what are your key considerations regarding trade-offs in those kinds of situations?
You're asking me?
For Oscar, yeah.
Yeah, so what happens is that typically, well, among mammals, you'll typically find animals that tend to have better lives. But this is not universal. So, but when you look at different traits in life history, in the life history of different animals, so there are certain animals who tend to have many offspring, and most of them die typically when they are very young, and because they die so young, they don't have many opportunities for having positive welfare, but they experience the suffering of their deaths very often. So we can then consider that premature death may be a proxy to the amount of suffering that there is in that population. It's just a very rough indicator. So that means that it would be better when you can make a decision concerning what animals are going to be out there. Like, for instance, suppose that you are reforesting a certain area, and you can reforest it with, I don't know, with oaks or with pine trees or whatever. And suppose that out of researching ecology and so on, you can not predict, but consider it more likely that if you plant oaks, the tendency would be that there are animals who tend to have longer lives and who tend to have less suffering in their lives. Then that would be a consideration in favor of doing that rather than planting the other plants. Then also, for instance, there may be cases where something interesting happens, which is that suppose that you consider what happens when efforts are made to conserve certain population of very large animals. So, for instance, there may be bison or there may be elephants. So, while this changes in the case of different animals for a number of factors that we don't have here the time to address, what as a general consideration we may take into account is that these animals, because they are so large, they eat very, very large amounts of biomass. And if they weren't there eating this biomass, then that biomass would be eaten by smaller animals who tend to have typically worse lives. So that would be a reason to promote the conservation of those animals, not just for the sake of those animals, because they typically have good lives, but also because in that way you are making it the case that the animals that are there are the ones that typically have better lives and not the ones that typically have bad lives. And there are other examples of decisions of the kind. So yeah, in practice this is interesting because in practice this leads us to be concerned with the animals that really are less important in the equation. But the reason for this is that you want to reduce the population of those who tend to have very bad lives in comparison to the former.
Okay, I think we can, start asking questions to Peter, and also, you don't have to, be asking about what we just discussed today. You can share with us your deepest concerns in general.
There was a question there. Maybe it's for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here, that I was going to ask. Thank you very much for everything that you both have said. But I was going to ask if we can ask a far more radical question that it's beyond ethics, maybe. That it's, what if the main point that we are missing out here is that our lives and the lives of animals are not that different? We don't have to be radically separating our life from the life of an animal because we depend on the material bodies that we have as animals do. So maybe, I agree that maybe the most practical way for everyone is trying to be vegan or trying to be vegetarian, because with that it comes the concern. And I think that in university I am all the time talking with people which is vegan or vegetarian, and they share these views that we tend to philosophically conceive in the Occidental philosophy that reason is somehow a superior thing that we have as humans. And the problem that I see here with ethics of animals is that sometimes we fall in this same mistake, considering that we have to give with we have throughout history take from animals the rights, and we have to give them back those rights. But those are, for me, human rights. And what I am concerned about is the constructing the very sense of the meaning of being human, and considering that we are animals. And since we are animals, we have to give to all other animals the same rights. And this is what anti-speciesism is about, that I know that it's what the center of animal ethics is concerned, and that's it. I would just really like to know what you think about that.
Okay. Do you want to?
I'm not sure if you're asking all three of us or what. So firstly, if Paolo asked me to go first, but I hope that Paolo and Oscar will say something as well. So my position is not really based on rights, not in a fundamental sense, and that's true for humans as well as it's true for animals. As has been said, it's based on utilitarianism, which essentially means it's based on the idea of trying to achieve the best possible well-being for all sentient beings. And of course that does include non-human animals. And I agree totally that we are animals. I think that's obvious. But, when you say you want to give the same rights, there are differences that, you just said things to me and the others and the rest of the audience that we understood, which you could not say to any non-human animal. And those cognitive differences that we have mean that we understand more about what's happening in the world. We understand more about what's likely to happen to non-human animals in the world. Unfortunately, it also means we have the power to do terrible things to non-human animals, like put them in factory farms or perform awful experiments on them. So rather than talk about giving them the same rights, which will then be open to these obvious challenges that, well, what does the right to freedom of thought and discussion mean for an animal? I think that it's better to say we should give the same weight to their interests as we give to the similar interests of humans, which is the position that I've defended. And it means that we do not discount the fact that they are not human beings in weighing up the importance of making sure that their lives do go as well as they possibly can for them, and that they're not lives of misery or suffering because of what we are doing to them, or because of, more broadly, what we're doing to the world as a whole.
So yesterday I mentioned briefly the idea of human rights for apes. My main reason not to use that expression is that in our experience in the Great Ape Project, this is something that the press typically manipulates to caricature the proposal, and it also sometimes genuinely just causes a lot of confusion. It doesn't cause a confusion when it happens within a philosophical conference where somebody like Paola Cavalieri can explain that by that she means some very minimal requirements that are negative, their rights to be left alone, and that the state is responsible for so it has some similarities with human rights. But given that these are the reasons and that it can cause more confusion and so be counterintuitive, on the one hand, no, counterproductive, I agree that, maybe if you want to create controversy and attract attention, maybe that's a good, thing to do. But I agree with Oscar that sometimes we have a duty to aid animals, so I don't want to be restricted to negative rights. Also, with the Great Ape Project, we started with the right not to be killed, not to be tortured, and not to be imprisoned without good justification. But now in the Great Ape Project, we are also defending the right not to be bought and sold, the mistreatment, no? Maltrato, which is not exactly like torture. Torture is to create intense pain in order to extract information, and most of the cases that we found in Spain was basically abandonment or other forms of creating suffering which do not fit with the idea of torture or intention or I don't know. There are many other rights that I think we should be defending in the future, such as territorial protection for the great apes and so on. And sometimes you don't want to be confined to this idea that they have to be very basic, minimal, and that the state is responsible, because everyone is buying stuff with palm oil, and everyone is implicated, buying mobile phones and, implicated in what we're doing to the great apes globally. So, I don't want to reduce the responsibility of the individual by emphasizing the importance of the state role in defending those rights. So, just to cut a long story short, I think it's better just to continue to, simian rights for apes and human rights for animals. I mean, there are other aspects of the things that you say, that I agree. People exaggerate the distinction between humans and animals, but maybe I just leave Oscar to.
Well, I would just add one thing, and it's unrelated to what you've said, though I think it can complement it, which is that what's relevant really is not that we are animals. What's relevant is that we are sentient beings. So there are animals that are not sentient, like, for instance, or that are very unlikely to be sentient. I mean, I would say, like, the odds are similar to that of inanimate objects, like, for instance, sponges, which have no nervous system at all. And then we can perfectly think of future sentient entities that would be non-biological, like, for instance, non-biological, like, digital, artificial intelligence that were sentient. If this eventually happens, those entities would be morally considerable. So, yeah, I would just say that there is nothing in itself relevant in our being animal. There is everything relevant in our being sentient. Our being sentient, that's the most fundamental group to which we belong is not that of human beings or that of Catalonians, is that of being sentient.
Different question? Katia. Yeah.
Hi. So thanks very much for your presentations. I have two questions. The first question is both for Peter and Oscar. And then I have a very different question, but it's just for you. So taking the previous discussion about wild animal suffering, so I remember that in 2000, some years ago, 2015, I think, when you were here in Barcelona, you told us that you considered wild animal suffering, so the problem that Oscar just briefly explained, to be one of the most important topics to work in animal ethics. So at that time, I was deeply, it was deeply encouraging for me to hear this because I was doing my PhD on this topic, so it was important. But in the last years, so the situation and the interest on this topic has substantially increased. A lot of papers have been published in top journals, books, special issues, not only within academia, but also outside academia. As Oscar mentioned, we have some top charities working on this, such as Animal Ethics and Wild Animal Initiative. So I was thinking, what is your current view on this topic, and what are your prospects for the development of this research area? I also want to hear Oscar on the part of the prospects.
Thank you. So I continue to think this is a really important area of research into animal ethics. And I'm glad that there has been this increasing attention paid to it. I mean, there's a lot of interesting research going on. But at the same time, and I'm not sure whether I said this in 2015, but I probably thought it. At the same time, I think that as an activist or campaigning priority, I think it's much lower. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is that I think many people are not ready for it, although Oscar's figures suggest, at least with the sample that he gave, that I could be mistaken about that, and I may be, I don't know. But another really important reason is that it is clearly going to divide the environmental movement from the animal movement, because this is where we're going to be at odds if we start suggesting that we should interfere with nature to reduce the suffering of wild animals. There are a lot of people who are going to say, no, that's a bad thing. There is intrinsic value in leaving nature alone, and we shouldn't try to do that. So at this stage of the rather limited success of both the animal movement and the environmental movement, I think it would be really bad if we were to be in conflict with each other, rather than to be allies, as we can be on many issues. Issues like factory farming, for example, or the environmental movement has even got quite serious now about eating meat, which a decade or so ago it wasn't. You had a lot of these environmental organizations, certainly in the United States, were serving meat at a variety of events. And in fact, even at the Rio +20 conference a few years ago, all about the environment and climate change, they were serving meat there. I co-authored an opinion piece for the Washington Post with a friend to object to that. So we can get we have some issues that we agree on with the environmental movement, and I think they're really important issues, and we should try to continue to work together rather than get involved in actively campaigning for changes that would be strongly opposed by the environmental movement. Now, that's not to deny, as perhaps Oscar was saying in his presentation, that there are some, perhaps, some areas of wild animal suffering that we can do something about, and where, because they're relatively limited in the changes that they would involve in nature, they may not have opposition or significant opposition from the environmental movement. So where that's true, I certainly support doing that. But doing it on the larger scale, I think we're not ready for yet, and I'm not sure when we're likely to be. Does Oscar want to comment on?
Yeah, so, well, you asked about the prospects, so I'll say just something very brief, and then I'll, something else on what you just said. So, concerning the prospects, so basically there are different lines of work right now. So, maybe the main one is has to do with furthering what has been called welfare biology as a field of research in academia. So welfare biology, as you know, would be research on what is good and bad for animals, but considering all their environments as well. So basically it's something like conservation biology, but from the point of view of what is good and bad for animals. So this would be a cross-disciplinary field that would incorporate contributions from the animal welfare sciences and also the sciences of ecology, biology, and others in order to learn more about this. So this would be one line of work, and it seems, I would say that maybe in the 30s, next decade, we would have seen, we would then see significant progress. So I think in this decade, we are going to be building this, and in the next decade, I'm not going to say that this is like a well-established field, but that field would exist, even if at a small scale. Then another field of action is spreading concern about this among animal advocates, and I think that significant progress has been done. So, as you mentioned before, only 2 organizations are working on this, but what happens is that many other people and the leaders of other organizations are well aware of this topic, and many of them are on board totally with this. They're just reluctant about starting to work on this. But I think that in the next years, like 10 years from now, at that point, we would be in a situation where we would see that different organizations have started not necessarily to actively work in campaigns for this, though some would, but also to incorporate this in their messaging, that we should be concerned with animals in the wild. And then concerning other aspects like working in policy, that work has only been planned so far. So there are talks going on, people working with animal law, we have been speaking with them and so on, but it's not a work that is in progress at this point. And then concerning reaching wider people from the general public, I think that will not be the main focus in the next decade, though it will happen, even if only as a consequence of the previous work. And just one thing, just to clarify, I agree with some of the concerns that Peter has expressed, but due to this, the implication of this is not that we shouldn't work on this. The implication is that we should be very careful and we should plan our strategy very, very carefully as well. So that's why, for instance, in the case of all the ways of helping animals that I presented, I never tackled the more radical ones, because maybe the most radical ones are going to give rise to a backlash and that people will oppose it. Well, we just don't propose those things. We propose the things that are going to be acceptable. And in doing this, we're going to promote that further research is being done, and then maybe 10 years from now, it will be possible to propose some things that aren't possible to propose reasonably right now. But this is the way in which we will ensure that in the long term, we're going to make we're going to have the highest impact in the field.
I think the next question was Cecilia.
Okay.
Okay. Well, ask the second question. Now you have phone. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. The second question has nothing to do with this. So it's related to what you were commenting yesterday about the origins of animal liberation and the influences. So you reminded us of the influence that the leaflet of Richard Ryder had on the development of the thesis of animal liberation. And so some people, especially Robert Garner, now with the new book on the Oxford Group and the development and the emergence of animal rights, so have highlighted the role of other people or other figures in the Oxford group, and especially the figure of Rosalind Godlovich. So I wanted to know, especially if you could tell us a little bit more about this figure, because usually we don't hear much about this person, and since she was a woman, which is also usually omitted in the history. So I wanted to know how the work of Rosalind Godlovich, especially how she thought about the equal consideration of human and non-human interests, has impacted your views in general and the thesis of animal liberation in particular.
Thanks very much, and thank you for mentioning Rosalind Godlovich, who was an absolutely crucial figure in the development of my thought. So just to chronicle this briefly, the initial person who awakened me to the idea that our treatment of animals raises an important ethical issue was Richard Keshen, who was a Canadian philosophy student, graduate student, as I was a graduate student in Oxford in 1970. Richard then introduced me to, if you like, two things by women. One was the book Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison, which was the first book on factory farming, the only book on factory farming available at the time. And reading that had made an immense impact on me. And particularly what impacted me was the fact that she made her case by quoting farming journals, not by quoting just the RSPCA or other pro-animal organisations. And showing that the farming journals assume this idea that if you can do something to animals that will make their products cheaper and therefore improve your profitability, that was the normal thing to do. Of course, you would do that. And that became clear, and that was one of the things that persuaded me that there was a complete lack of ethics in the production of the food I was eating. But the second woman who was influential on me was Rosalind. And I had... so she was not a philosophy student herself. She was the wife of Stanley Godlovich, who was a graduate student in philosophy, but was not so much interested in ethics, though he was interested in biology and philosophy of biology, and was well up on ethology. Stanley actually introduced me to the work of Nicholas Tinbergen, who was an ethologist who wrote about seagulls in particular. Was really interesting work. But Rosalind, although she was not a student, was really interested in the ethical questions. And Stan and Ros were both vegetarians at the time, so Richard and his wife Mary were the first ethical vegetarians that I'd met, really, and Stan and Ros were the second. But I spent a lot of time talking to Ros. She and Stan and a philosopher called John Harris, but not the person called John Harris who has been a contemporary philosopher. It's very confusing because they were both graduate students in Oxford in philosophy at the time, but the John Harris I'm referring to did not go on with philosophy. They were editing a book called Animals, Men and Morals, which the first thing I ever wrote about animal liberation under the title Animal Liberation was a review of that book for the New York Review of Books in 1973. And so they had already thought quite a lot about this, and Ros in particular had thought a lot about the ethics, and at one stage was planning to get into philosophy and to do a PhD on this, but eventually didn't. But she was not a utilitarian. She was approaching it in a different way. So the principle of equal consideration of interests that you mentioned was, if you like, my imposing my more utilitarian view on the idea of anti-speciesism, which Richard Ryder was also somebody who I was introduced to, perhaps through Rosenstan or through Richard, I don't really remember. So they were all part of Oxford, and for those who didn't get the reference, there is this quite recent book called The Oxford Group and the Origins of the Animal Movement, and that may not be the exact title, but it's something like that, by Robert Garner and Ukulele Okuwe, I think, a woman who was working with Rob on it. And if you're interested in the history of this period, it's good that there has been this scholarly study done of it. So they were producing Animals, Men and Morals, and I at this stage wasn't thinking about writing myself in this area because they were going to produce this book. And the book was a collection of essays. It wasn't a single author book. They had a lot of people, including Richard Ryder, writing about animal experimentation and various other people writing about it. But the book came out and it was completely ignored, ignored by the media. It did not get a single review in the British press. The exception was a one-paragraph mention in a column, but it was really ignored, and it was very disappointing because we'd all hoped that this would have a big impact. So I wrote that review of it when, despite the disappointing reception in Britain, an American publisher said that they would publish it in the US. And I thought, well, I'll try and improve the prospects of it getting known in the US, and the obvious place to try to do that was the New York Review of Books, which was sort of the place for radical thought at the time that everybody progressive read. And by this stage, I was no longer a graduate student, but a very junior lecturer at University College, which meant I could say that I was actually an Oxford academic rather than merely a student, and I think that probably improved my chances of getting it accepted. Though I do need to thank the editor, Robert Silvers, for his openness to the idea. So that was really why I started writing about it, and then from the New York Review article, I got an invitation to write a book on it. And I still was a bit reluctant to do that at first because as long as it seemed like Ros might write something, I thought, she could do that and I could work on other issues. I didn't need to do the issue that she had played an important role in changing my thought about. But then she abandoned that project. It was clear that it was not going ahead by then. So I did write it. Now, one thing I should say about why you hear rather little about Ros, and it's clear in the authors of the book mention it, most of the people in that Oxford group agreed to be interviewed by the authors to give our account of what happened. Ros declined. I think she made some remark like that was a long time ago and left it at that. I'm not quite sure why, but I haven't. I'm in contact with Richard and Mary Keshen. I was in contact with Stan Godlovich for quite a while. Ros ceased to communicate with me, and I think she ceased to communicate with the Keshens as well. I think it's not just discrimination against women that she doesn't have a major role in that book. I think it's the fact that she was not prepared to talk to the authors of the book that was a factor there, and hasn't written or done anything about the issue since. I wouldn't like to speculate on the reasons for that.
Okay. But I think Cecilia was first, no?
Hello. Good. So I have more than a question, is an advice for people that is starting with the activism for animals. So, but first I want to talk a little bit about myself from my personal story a bit. In terms that I start working as an activist, animal defender in Europe, in Belgium actually. So advocating in an European level, so not even the Belgian national level, but the European level within the institutions. So we started working with topics, the current topics, which are like the ban of using testing animals for cosmetics, or the ban of for farming, even the more restrictions and control on the transport of export of live animals, and these sort of topics that are currently very hot in Brussels specifically. So so I started. This is where I start for the first time getting to know all this world. And then I come from Colombia, but I've been living abroad from more than 12 years, and in Belgium since 7 years ago. And then I give a look to my home country, And I saw they were also talking about the same topics. So we also having currently a draft law for banning cages in Colombia. And I saw we already banned circuses since long ago. We don't have wild animals used in circuses. And we don't have, as we discussed yesterday, the testing on cosmetics has been also banned in Colombia. So I felt so empowered because I said, wow, my country is talking on the same level than Brussels. You know, we can relate. We also have a politician right now who just won a seat in the Congress who is pushing for a ban for live export of animals because Colombia exports animals to the Middle East, to different countries. So so I was very entitled and empowered, let's say, and yeah, also entitled to come into the discussion. And then I created this NGO that it's been 1 year I'm working on it, which is called SOS Animals Colombia. And I'm working with Colombian organizations who've been working for like more than 20 years, some of them, in the animal rights and animal welfare field. But then I decided to go to Colombia for 4 months, for the first time in 10 years. And I realized like our reality is so far from being at the level of Europe, or at least Belgium, or more Eastern Europe, not Eastern, Central Europe, because we still have so many stray dogs and mistreatment and very basic things that people is doing there to animals that and I start wondering, why are we talking about cosmetics, testing, and some topics that we're not ready for it. And then I start thinking about, for example, the concept, which I struggle to pronounce, I'm sorry, specism. And I started wondering, why are we talking about this concept in Latin American countries? Isn't it too confusing? And it's something that Paula was saying, it's gonna be used by the media so wrongly and nobody knows what it means and it's very complicated. So in the communications of my organization, I said, please, we will avoid the concept, or for example, multi-species concept as well. They use it a lot in the animal welfare movement there, and I'm like, but that's so confusing. I mean, it's, we are addressing Colombian politicians. They don't know where is that. So we're having all this, all these discussions in my mind, discussions with the organizations there that, are very happy being or feeling that they are using the same concept like anti-specism, or and they talk about, oh, this is an anthropocentric view. It looks like this concept seems so complicated for a country like it's really, I think, giving the first steps, even though it sounds like we went further. So my question for you, more an advice, is what do you advise as not only me as a person who is starting this very challenging path, but also the organizations in third or developing countries, not only Latin America, but for example, African countries that are, starting this, but how do you think they should start, like based on your experience? Sorry, it took too long.
No, sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks for recounting your experiences. So I'm not going to advise you from Colombia to how to best advance the cause of animals in Colombia. I think you clearly have more knowledge of that than I do. I don't think it's essential to use the concept of speciesism. If you feel, and after talking to other people involved with animal welfare issues in Colombia, if others share your view, that this is not going to be well understood at this present stage. And I would obviously say the same to Africans. I think it's really important to support organizations in these countries. And when I received, as Paula mentioned yesterday, the Berggruen Prize and gave it away to organizations that I felt were doing good, I did give it to organizations that are working for animals in Latin America and in Africa and in Asia, because I think, in a sense, the the fact that standards are somewhat less there, that the movements are less developed, means that you probably get better value for money in terms of trying to make changes there. But there is one thing that you said about Colombia that I would like to push back on a little bit, and you said, well, things are really bad because there's a lot of stray dogs in the street. Right. I'm sure you weren't thinking of that as the only thing, but you know, there is a tendency with animal organizations to focus on dogs and cats because people have them as companion animals, they care for them, and it's easier to get their attention and perhaps to get them to donate money if you do that. And I know, you know, spent a little bit of time in China and talking to animal organizations in China. Again, they're very much, you know, you can get lots of attention for cruelty to dogs and cats. You can't get attention for cruelty to chickens or pigs. And yet, you know, the numbers of chickens and pigs so, you know, outweigh the total number of all the dogs in these countries. And the lives of the chickens and pigs are so much worse than the life of the typical dogs and cats, even if lots of them are strays, that I really think you should be trying as soon as you can to get some focus on factory farming as the real test of whether a country is willing to change. And when you said that Colombia is, in its law, though not in its practice, like Brussels, you know, does Colombia follow even the present EU standards on the sizes of cages for laying hens, just to take one example? And after all, Brussels is talking about getting rid of cages altogether. And I hope that that happens in the next year or two. Is Colombia going to do that? And you know, unless yes, you think it might? They want to? Fantastic. Well, if that's so, then I think and if that really happens and is enforced, I think you will be able to feel empowered by being Colombian, and you will say Colombia, at least of the countries outside the EU, is among the world leaders because, you know, the United States has not banned cages for hens. Australia has not banned cages for hens. The United States still has about 2/3 of the laying hens in the United States are in the standard battery cages. Yes, there has been some progress in particular states where there are citizen-initiated referenda. California is the largest of them. They have banned cages, or they've at least required that all animals have to be able to stretch their limbs fully, which for a hen, of course, means you can't be in a battery cage because you can't stretch your limbs. But that's only covering about, well, less than 1/3 of the hens. And then there are some corporations that, like supermarket chains, that are not supplying eggs from those caged hens. And even fast food chains like McDonald's is phasing them out, though it hasn't got rid of them altogether. So the result of that, on the most recent figures I saw, is that of the roughly 300 million laying hens in the United States, maybe 100 million of them are not in battery cages, but the rest will be.
Yeah, because in Belgium and EU, all European countries, I think, battery cages are banned ages ago. So that was like one step. And then my point is always like, why would should we jump the different steps that
Cecilia,
Yes.
you don't have the microphone and all the
Yeah,
people
the
who are
answer is yes.
following online, they
You
can-
should jump the
but
different steps.
there's
Yes,
several people
you should go for
there are
cage-free
several
altogether.
questions. So, Diego, can you? Okay, the next one.
Okay. Oh, hi to the panel. Peter, I'm a fellow Australian. I just wanted to say hi. You're not alone there.
How you going, mate? Right?
How's it going? Very good. My question is a bit less academic, a bit more personal for the whole panel, anyone that wants to respond. A lot of people here, I think, have stopped eating animal products, but maybe they don't consider themselves activists. That's the position that I'm in. And I just wanted to know your experiences and your advice when it comes to the typical social situations that we have to confront every day. And if, particularly Peter, because you've been alive longer than the other panelists, and how things have evolved with your own family members or friends, I think that it would be interesting for us to hear all of your perspective.
Okay, I'll say something, but I hope Paula and Oscar will as well. Things have changed dramatically. One example of that is that when I became a vegetarian, the best-known vegetarian restaurant in London was called Cranks. And basically that was the idea that vegetarians, most people thought vegetarians were cranks in one way or another. And the other relevant factor is that if you had talked about being a vegan to anyone, nobody would have known what that word meant. There was a vegan society, was founded in the 1940s actually. I think it had 300 members, and that was probably the majority of the vegans in the United Kingdom. So there's been a really dramatic change, obviously, and with the availability of vegan food is a big change. In terms of social situations, my wife and I became vegetarian together. We very soon learnt that if anybody invited us for dinner, we had to make it very clear what we ate and what we didn't eat, because otherwise it's really terrible. If you're invited for dinner, you go to dinner, they've prepared a meal that you don't eat, and it's embarrassing for them, and it's difficult for you. So, that to me was the major social lesson that we had to learn, if we were eating with people, to let them know what we could eat. But otherwise, I don't think there are really big social problems. I suppose there were some issues with family because, my parents were not vegetarian. We became vegetarian in Oxford and they were in Australia, so it took a while before that had a practical impact, and we told them, of course, of our change. And they adjusted, and other family adjusted. So I didn't have great problems with the rest of, social problems in terms of the change of diet.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything because we don't have a lot of time and there are many questions. So, unless you want to say something, okay.
No, just one thing, maybe.
Okay.
I remember the times where sentences like this were uttered, like, there is a new vegan in Valencia. And not just, like 20 years ago, maybe, those sentences were uttered.
So the next question is, okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. For Professor Singer, are developments in philosophy of biology and ethology relevant for the moral defense of animals? I'm thinking about, for example, Peter Godfrey Smith or Helen Stewart's books, for instance. Thank you.
So I certainly think that ethology is important for understanding animals, understanding how, I think Paula said earlier when response to the question about we are animals, that it is important, people exaggerate the differences between us and animals and don't have a sufficiently complex and nuanced view of the lives of animals. So I think ethology has been important in introducing that view to a lot of people. A lot of different writers with different animals have helped us to understand the great apes are obvious, and Jane Goodall's work had an influence with me, and Diane Fossey and Marita Goldikas, but also remarkable work on so many other species now, on elephants, for example, but also I mentioned Tinbergen's work on seagulls, and there's a lot of other work being done on birds now, which I think is really interesting because obviously they have quite small brains, but their brains seem to be highly efficient for size. So yeah, I welcome all that work, and I think it's important that it should continue.
Okay, next question.
Can I use my microphone prerogative to ask a question?
Yes, of course, Diego.
I wanted to ask this question in the population and climate change session, but there was no time. So, and maybe it's the kind of question Oscar thinks is controversial and that maybe we shouldn't talk about. But it's a question for Peter. I've heard, not read, published anywhere, a trend of people saying that climate change will actually be improve the situation we're in terms of aggregate suffering, because desertification will reduce the number of small animals that are the ones that we think produce more aggregate suffering, and therefore will be positive or net positive. Just what do you think about that, or maybe Oscar or other people that are in the room that know more about this topic? Thank you.
Well, I'm doubtful, and I wouldn't want to not make efforts about climate change for that reason. It's clearly hard to estimate what the impact on animal suffering is going to be, and you have to balance this with the fact that there will be suffering caused by the climate change. There already is suffering caused by climate change to lots of animals that are not adapting to it, in addition to the problems for humans. So I would not slacken on my efforts to encourage drastic action and reaching zero emissions as soon as possible for that reason. But I'd like to hear what Oscar has to say.
Well, it's likely that the number of animals will increase due to climate change. It will be the number of aquatic animals will be reduced, so there will be less crustaceans, for instance. But the number of animals like insects and animals who live, on the land, it will be increased because of the distribution of land areas in the globe. So it seems that that will be a further consideration, even if there is a lot of uncertainty, to oppose climate change.
The next question. Oh, okay.
Regarding as well population reduction and this kind of stuff, I was wondering because even if we are to focus in individual choices instead of policies and this kind of stuff, I mean, whether when we are trying to encouraging people not to have children, I mean sometimes even the personal reasons behind this decision and also the discourse behind this kind of encouraging that certain institutions may make, for example, providing education or giving condoms or whatever, may have to do with immediate poverty. I mean, this kind of decision may have to do with whether a person can afford or not have, or not affording to having a children, for instance, and not having anything to do with moral reasons. I mean, and most generally speaking, when we are introducing money into the picture, we are creating some kind of unfairness that may render some kind of freedom or some kind of individual choice kind of meaningless. And we are introducing somehow class bias that, well, I think that has not been addressed in the conferences before. Well, thank you very much.
So obviously, class differences and class bias and money make a big difference to individual choices, but I don't think we can wait for the end of capitalism before we try to help animals or do something about climate change. I don't see that as happening anytime soon. So I think we're stuck with the fact that money makes a difference. We're stuck with the fact that there are very great inequalities in the amount of money that people have, and I think we have to try to do the best we can within that framework. I don't really see an alternative open to us at present.
Yeah, okay.
Hello. This is a question to Peter. So it relates to the idea of the separateness of persons objection to utilitarianism, or it's been used against other theories too. But do you think that there's a way that we should consider the separateness of different individuals as a spectrum? So yesterday Paula had a presentation that had caterpillars and parrots and persons and apes. I was just wondering whether you think that there's different ways that we should understand different species or different individuals as separatable or as living separate lives to the other similar individuals.
That's an interesting question. It's not something I've thought about in quite that way. For those who are not philosophers, John Rawls makes this objection to utilitarian ways of thinking. He says it fails to take seriously the separateness of persons, and he defends the idea about rights and about not simply evaluating the total sum of well-being on the basis that to do so is to fail to take seriously the separateness of persons. I've never really been very impressed by this objection, I have to say. I think that it's clear that utilitarians recognise that people are separate, but that doesn't mean that you can't compare the well-being of different persons, or that it's not better to increase overall well-being across these separate persons. I think that's still something that is worth doing. Your question, if I've understood it correctly, is asking whether the separateness of persons is something that only applies to humans or to beings above a certain cognitive level, so perhaps including great apes, but not all humans, as Oscar's slide with a blue circle around it showed. I would presume that any being who is a subject of experiences, even if it's one of those mealworms in Oscar's slide, and I have to say I'm not sure whether mealworms really are subjects of experiences or not, but let's just assume that they are, then they're still separate, and despite the fact that they're all clumped together in that amazing mass, they're all having their individual experiences. So I would think the separateness of persons applies to any being that is capable of having experiences, any sentient being, in other words.
Next.
Oh, okay, perfect. I also have a question for Professor Singer, and also relates to the presentation before about population growth and climate change, and especially to biodiversity, because I thought that I think for example, indigenous tribes, they're cultivating at the moment 80% of the whole world's biodiversity. And then I thought, why, if we, for example, like protected their indigenous rights, which are also part of the human rights. So if we adhere to the rules that we set ourselves, would that be enough to, combat against climate change and thereby avoiding the population growth question, or are we already like beyond this point where just promoting these rights would be enough to fight against climate change, and we already are or have moved to an area where it's unavoidable to, for example, promote or protect indigenous rights, for example, by exposing them to deforestation or whatever, and invading their territories, because our population is constantly growing and we need resources. So the question basically is if it's still, are we still at the point where it is enough to protect human rights and indigenous rights, or did we already move beyond that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we have already moved beyond that, because the changes that we've made through our industrialized civilization to the planet clearly affect the entire planet, including places where indigenous people live. So, you know, we could protect those places in the sense of saying you can't cut down the forests, or you can't mine the land that they're on, or whatever else that might be. But climate change is still going to affect those areas, and it'll affect them obviously in different ways. But for some of them living in arid or desert zones, it may prevent them being able to survive there at all. So there are definitely things that we have to do. And also it depends a little on how, you know, who you define as indigenous. If you're talking about people who are still having a tribal hunter-gatherer existence, relatively untouched by more modern civilization, then okay, maybe you could protect them and you could say they've lived sustainably for thousands of years and they'll continue to do so. But that's not always the case. There are certainly indigenous populations who do have access to modern healthcare, for example, and modern technologies, using modern weapons to kill animals rather than the more traditional ones, which were clearly less effective. And so you are still going to get loss of biodiversity because of their population may be growing, they need to feed themselves, and even if they're indigenous, they may still want to make some money by not just feeding themselves, but selling bushmeat for markets in the cities. So no, unfortunately, we're well past the point, I believe, at which simply protecting indigenous rights would save biodiversity and prevent further climate change.
Okay, maybe we can take one or two more. Is that Jose next? Oh, no.
I would like to ask you, what intrinsic value do you give to biodiversity?
That's a big problem for a utilitarian like me, because certainly a hedonistic utilitarian like me, because strictly speaking, the answer is none. And that's because, you know, biodiversity itself is not a value that is related to the sentience of the individual animals. I certainly do give value, as Paula pointed out, to the suffering of individual animals, but I give that whether they're of endangered species or of species that are not endangered. And often the suffering will be quite similar, you know, because they may be quite similar species, but one of them is endangered and another is not. And you know, then there are forests. I assume plants are not sentient beings, and so there's a lot of plant species that will cause loss of biodiversity. And if you're talking about intrinsic value, then, as I say, they don't have intrinsic value in my view. That troubles me because I certainly think we ought to protect them, and there is instrumental reasons why we should protect them, so that other sentient beings who live in those forests can survive, so that, you know, even for humans we need to have a healthy environment to provide water and other services that environments protect. And beyond that, I also think that there's aesthetic value, which is appreciated by humans and hopefully will be appreciated by future humans for thousands of years to come, which will be lost if we destroy biodiversity. So I think that's an important factor. But if you really, you know, want to focus on intrinsic value, that it's even if you were the last person on Earth, it would be wrong to amuse yourself by setting fire to a forest in which there are no sentient beings living. You know, I find it difficult to say why that would be wrong if you really were going to be the last person on Earth and there were no sentient beings affected by your setting fire to the forest.
Okay, was it Jose, no? Next.
Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yes, 2 interventions ago, you said that you were not convinced by this objection about the separateness of persons, and I have understood that you were able to disregard that because a time ago you considered that preferences were that matter, but since you're defending now a hedonist position, what is now, how can you defend that that objection is not, you are not convinced by that objection, since for a hedonist is...
Yeah, no, I don't think it depends on being a preference utilitarian. I think it depends on, as I was saying, individuals having experiences, and they are individual experiences. So, you know, in that sense, utilitarians don't deny that people are separate. The separateness of person objection basically is saying you can't trade off the pain of one being against the happiness of another, or even against the pains of another being. And, you know, that's just an assertion. Saying that persons are separate doesn't, to me anyway, give a good reason why, if there are sort of many people suffering relatively mild pain and one person suffering more severe pain, you know, it might not be better to help the many people suffering the milder pain. It will depend on how mild it is and how many people there are. But I do think that it's ethically acceptable to take into account everybody's pain and suffering and to sum up across them. And I don't think that denies that they're separate.
Okay, so one further question, if I may. So what would be, if is it possible that you develop or just briefly state your position about the harm that death poses, and what is your position about this replaceability argument? Because I think it's related to this, right? If you could create, perhaps not animals, but also human beings that are, you know, that have better lives than the one that you are suppressing, or yes, suppressing, let's say, what would be your position about that? Would that be permissible under certain circumstances? I assume no, but yes.
So I'm not quite sure exactly what you're talking about, but one of the places in which the replaceability argument comes up is with farmed animals. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
well, yes.
Yeah.
For instance.
Okay,
Yes.
so so the objection here, this is often put as an objection to the idea that we should be vegan or vegetarian, on the grounds that if you had a farm that really treated animals well, where their lives were positive, but then they were killed obviously before they got old, because nobody will buy animals that have died a natural death. Then as long as you could replace them by other animals that were equally living happy lives, that would be a justifiable thing to do. Now, there it is true that I used to say that if the animals are capable of thinking about themselves as having a future, then the replaceability argument didn't work, because you were thwarting that preference, and the one that you were bringing into existence didn't have a preference before it came into existence. As a hedonist, I agree that that objection to the replaceability argument is not open to me. So I suppose on that, it does go back to that question about population that I was talking about earlier, and some of Parfitt's views. And I do find that a baffling issue. And although you can think of pragmatic reasons why you wouldn't want replaceability, certainly if they were ruminants, that would increase greenhouse gases. But anyway, you could say it might contribute to the attitude that animals are objects for us to use, and as long as we do that and eat them, even if we're careful that they have good lives, it will still make it harder to really treat them as they ought to be treated. So I think there are those practical reasons why I would not want to support or buy the products of those animals. But if you really make it a kind of hypothetical case where there are no practical bad consequences flowing from it, then maybe I don't have an objection to it.
Thank you for the answers and for both presentations.
Okay. Now, just want to thank Peter for coming to visit us and answering all our questions, and to Oscar and Felix as well. Just thank him.
Thank you.
And if you want to come for...
let's thank Paola too, and all the others who have organised this. It's a huge amount of work to put such an event together.
Diego.